Okay, Chapter 6, The Duel for North America. This chapter is, I would say it's of moderate importance. The most important thing about Chapter 6 is it talks about the French and Indian War. And the French and Indian War is really the first cause of the American Revolution. And a lot of the stuff that happens during this chapter sets the precedent for stuff that happens in Chapter 7, and it's like the first time that the colonists do certain things or protest certain things, come together for certain things, and it serves as almost like the training ground for the revolutionary generation, both militarily and politically, for the events of the 1770s then. So, it's called the French and Indian War, so we got to talk about France. The French didn't settle the New World the same way that the Spanish or the English did. They were kind of late in the game, and so there wasn't a whole lot of land in the New World left, and so they were basically forced to go north, primarily in Canada. And so the St. Lawrence River, which is in the upper Atlantic, that was their avenue into Canada. And from there you can get into the Great Lakes, and eventually you can get to the Mississippi River. And basically the French explorers, the voyageurs was their name. It's kind of like the French version of conquistador. They would paddle up and down these rivers. They would meet these Indians, and unlike really the English and the Spanish as well, who tried to enslave the Indians or kill the Indians or just grab massive amounts of land, the French really weren't there to settle, to put large numbers of French people on these lands. They weren't there to enslave the Indians. They were there basically to do business. Primarily fur trading, and specifically beaver. Everybody back in Europe was wearing those tricorn beaver hats, and you can see that in the picture there in the middle of the Frenchie. And the tricorn hat, purchasing beaver pelts from the Indians, and apparently everybody enjoying a good smoke. So you can see, even though France was late in the game, they do acquire, at least nominally, or at least on the books, a huge swath of New World territory there. So what later becomes Illinois is right in the heart of this French territory, along with virtually all of Canada, and a large section of what later becomes the Midwest and the Rocky Mountain area there. This is France's empire at its greatest extent in 1700. There's going to be a series of wars we're going to see between Britain and France throughout the 1700s, not just the French and Indian War, which erode at this power that the French has. The Indians as well, they come to be more and more reliant on European goods. You got to remember that from the time that Columbus discovered essentially the Bahamas in 1492 to the French and Indian War, which was fought in the 1750s, that's hundreds of years of European and Indian contact and trade and intermarriage and all this other stuff. And nowadays we like to portray these Indians as like these noble, primitive hippies, right? That lived in like perfect harmony with the land. But that's simply not true. If they saw something that was useful, like a gun, they wanted it. An iron cook pot, which they didn't have, you can imagine that's very useful as well. And then obviously the horse, right? That completely changes the culture and the way of life for many, many Indians. Now the Indians, because they were doing business most peaceably with the French, they probably had the greatest friendship with the French, as opposed with the English and definitely the Spanish, who probably were the worst. These are trading posts, fur trading posts. The vast majority of them were French trading posts, and you can see they were all over the place. The thing that most pay attention to is that they're always along rivers or lakes. Even there in Illinois, if you look there and you say, well, there's a few trading posts there where there's in between the Mississippi River and Lake Michigan. if you actually look on a map, that traces the Illinois River almost exactly. All right, so I told you that there was some wars that no one ever hears about, no one ever talks about, and in fact, you won't be tested about these wars that happened prior to the French and Indian War. But starting, and I think I talked about this a few chapters ago, starting in about 1690 or so, Britain and France started to go to war against each other, and they continued for about the next 150 years or so. I mean, it was really a massive time period, and they weren't constantly at war with each other. There would be a decade of peace here or there, but for the most part, they hated each other constantly. So the first of these is King William's War, 1689 to 1697, and then subsequent, a few years later, Queen Anne's War, 1702 to 1713. Both of these wars, at least in the New World, Britain won, I guess you would say, and they were fought. They were fought in places that later become the United States, primarily in New York, Massachusetts, Maine, and Nova Scotia. And then finally, the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, it gave the northeastern tip of Canada, which we know today as Nova Scotia, to Britain. Also Newfoundland, which is real close to that, and Hudson Bay, that very large water inlet in the northern Canada there. So what did France still have? They basically had the St. Lawrence River, and then out west for Canada, and obviously in the Midwest of the United States then as well. These are those two French wars. And you can see where the fighting is. You can see the Schenectady later becomes Albany, Deerfield, and you can see Nova Scotia. So this is after the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, what it looks like. So you can see there's a narrow pinch of French territory along the St. Lawrence River. Then you can see the 13 colonies owned by England, and you can also see the Hudson Bay area. Now this in and of itself creates a problem for the French. It was probably short-sighted by them because they're being squeezed, right? They're being squeezed on two sides by the English, and it doesn't take a dummy to notice that in the years to come, the British are going to want to connect those two territories. Right? Same problem there in the south. We look at Florida is owned by Spain, and then also the Southwest. But that whole Mississippi River area is owned by France. So just the natural course of world events and world wars, when the battles that are going to take place are going to be fought on these kind of border areas, and whoever is the loser, they're going to have to end up forking over this stuff. So these are just some of the table in your book calls later English monarchs. Right, the first one that we really have to worry about in this class is Henry V. Obviously, Queen Elizabeth I is probably the most important one, and then it gets to these, and these are important for the founding of the United States. So you get King William's War, is named because it was fought during the reign of William III. You get Queen Anne's War, which is fought during the reign of Queen Anne. Then you got George I, and it is here that the navigation laws were laxly enforced. This is that period of salutary neglect where Britain was happy with the colonists doing basically whatever they wanted as long as Britain got paid. Then you get George II, who was the monarch during the French and Indian War. And then you get George III, and he comes to power at a very young age. I think he was in his 20s when he comes to power, and he's the monarch when the American Revolution is fought. All right, so the French and Indian War, I don't know if it's ironically enough or if it's just luck or just one of those weird things in U.S. history, but it's started by George Washington in 1754. The governor of Virginia sends a 21-year-old George Washington and I think 150 militiamen to basically survey Ohio country. Remember, through the headright system and through the original charter, Virginia claimed that they had land from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific Ocean, wherever that may be. And under the headright system, where a landowner would pay for the passage of an indentured servant, that landowner would get 50 acres, right? But it was 50 acres out west somewhere. And so over the period of years, certain families, including the Washington family, had amassed these just absolutely massive land holdings out west in this Ohio country, which Virginia claimed was part of Virginia, where these landowners had thousands and thousands and thousands of acres. And so in 1754, Virginia decided to figure out what that land looked like and start to come up with legitimate title and just figure out the logistics for parceling out this land. So the problem is that the French, of course, claimed that the Ohio country, if you remember from the map, was not Virginia, was not English colony, but was actually French territory. So George Washington and his militiamen come across a small detachment of French soldiers, and they get into a skirmish, and they kill them. So they kill the Frenchies. Not all of them, though. Some of the French escape. They go to the nearest French fort, and they say that there's a bunch of colonists, or militiamen, Americans, Englishmen, whatever you want to call them, that attack them. And so a very large detachment of French soldiers chases down Washington and the militiamen. And Washington's forced to try and create this hastily, as quick as you can type of fort in the middle of the woods that they call Fort Necessity. And there's some fighting, and it becomes very apparent that Washington and his guys are going to get crushed. And so Washington surrenders. So the first event, and the first big event, I guess I should say, in Washington's career is a surrender. And you're going to see throughout Washington's military career, while he's a very good leader, he's a shitty military commander. He loses almost every single battle that he's in. And this is no different. But Washington is smart enough to know that he loses all these battles. And so throughout the course of the Revolutionary War, he learns very early on that he can win by avoiding avoiding fighting the English. And so he devises all of these elaborate schemes to basically have narrowing and harrowing escapes from the English attack. And that actually is what pays off and results in the final win of the American Revolution. But we're not there yet. So Britain eventually hears about Washington's surrender. Washington was allowed to march back with his guys to Virginia with their tail between their legs. And Britain views this as an excuse to restart its now 50, 60-year ongoing war with France. And you remember when they got Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, they feared attack because there was a bunch of French Acadians. I think there was like 50, 60,000 of them or something like that, who lived in Nova Scotia. And they were very worried that all these Frenchies were going to start attacking and causing problems in this newish British holding up there in Canada. So they basically rounded up all these French civilians and they kicked them out. Right? They just gave them the boot from this area. Well, several thousand of these French Acadians went down, probably through the Great Lakes, probably through the Mississippi River, down to what later becomes Louisiana, because remember that was French territory at the time, and started living in the swamps down there. They become known as the Cajuns, and to this day, all that stuff that you see with swamp people and all the Cajun stuff down there, these are the descendants of those Canadian French Acadians who were exiled in the early stages of the French and Indian War in 1754, 1755. So this war escalates, and it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and it actually turns into a world war. It's fought not just in the colonies, it's also fought in Europe, it's also fought in Asia. Um, and as far as we're concerned in this course, it's called the French and Indian War. However, if you're in college and you take a more of a world history course, or if you take a course on British history or French history, it's called the 7 Years' War. So these are I said it turns into a world war. Well, there's been actually 9 world wars in the past 300-400 years or so, and you can see here that they're called different things in Europe and in America. You got King William's War and Queen Anne's War, which aren't called that in Europe. You see French and Indian War, which is called the 7 Years' War. The American Revolution is called that. Then you get the Wars of the French Revolution, which you may have studied about last year. Obviously, the Napoleonic Wars. They didn't really affect the United States, except for we kind of got in late in the game, and we call it the War of 1812. And then obviously World War I and World War II. Alright, so during the course of the French and Indian War, you have this line of French forts that are in and along the St. Lawrence River, and then out in west in Ohio country. And so most of the fighting is done along these borders. This doesn't just involve one colony. It just doesn't involve Virginia, although Virginia kind of starts it. Obviously, a large amount of this territory borders with Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and New York, and some of the other ones, Pennsylvania. And so many of the colonies are directly involved in this war. France teams up with Spain, so now the southern area of Georgia has to worry about invasion from Florida. We saw Spanish held Florida down there. So the British government actually summons the leaders from all these different colonies to an intercolonial congress to try and come up with a more unified response. So these different colonies weren't just sending random dudes and guns and money, but that they could actually have some sort of coordinated defense or hopefully offense to fight against France. The problem is, of these 13 colonies, only 7 colonies showed up. Basically, the guy who emerges as the leader in this Albany Congress, I should say, is Ben Franklin, the guy we know from Poor Richard's Almanac, and he's going to play a much larger role next 2 chapters in the Revolutionary War. He comes up with a system of colonial home rule, where basically the 13 colonies would be a self-governing, unified entity under the authority of Britain. So everybody thinks this is a great idea. They go back to their individual colonies, and the individual colony assemblies say, no, there's no way in hell we're going to give up that type of individual colonial power. And Britain says, oh, there's no way in hell that we're going to allow a system of home rule. Now, so in other words, the Albany Congress was a failure in the eyes of Benjamin Franklin for that role. However, I have here, it sets the precedent for future intercolonial congresses. Chapter 7 and Chapter 8 talk a lot about these now congresses and conferences and meetings that take place between the many colonies. And it also is just one of the steps towards home rule, one of the steps towards independence, because people are starting to think not just as New Yorkers or Virginians, but they're starting to think that New Yorkers and Virginians have something in common with each other that they need to team up with. And it's almost always an external threat. In this case, the external threat was France. Future, it's going to be Britain. This is the famous poster. You see it all the time, almost every single year, in either a DBQ or in the multiple choice section of the AP test. This is a poster that I guess was created by Benjamin Franklin, and you can see here it's a picture of the snake with most of the colonies' initials in there: South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, a few of the other ones, and you can see that it's segmented, and it basically is join or die. So the symbolism here is that if they join this Congress, if they join this multi-colonial entity, then they'll survive, and if not, they will die. This is a map of basically the fighting of the French and Indian War, and you can see a lot of it is fought in upstate New York. The kind of the Canadian frontier there by the St. Lawrence River, and then of course out west in Ohio country. There you can see Fort Duquesne. There's a bunch of battles that are fought over there, and in the upstate New York area, there Fort Ticonderoga in the Great Lakes region. You can see up here in the upper right, British deport 6,000 Acadians in the summer of 1755. So those are the descendants that eventually become the Cajuns in Louisiana. We also said it was a world war. And so you can see there on the bottom left, that's the stuff that we know about, that we've talked about in school and in American classrooms. But you can see all those battles that were fought in Europe and also in Asia. I mean, there was even battle fought in the Philippines in the mid-1700s amongst France and Britain, and Spain, I should say. This is a picture of your book. One of the major events of the French and Indian War was the capture of Quebec by the British in 1759. Apparently there's a big cliff, and the British were able to scale it, and once they did, they captured it. Alright, so the stuff that is important, because you don't really have to memorize the battles or the different events of the French and Indian War, really aside from the Albany Congress. But some of the things that you need to know are that prior to the French and Indian War, Americans viewed themselves as British, even though they had been born in the colonies, even though their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents had all been born in the colonies. They still viewed themselves as Englishmen. And they had viewed the British soldier as being like the super elite Navy SEAL of the day, that they were these invincible G.I. Joe type soldiers that were the perfect embodiment of military excellence. And the French and Indian War kind of destroys that. It also bolsters the colonial self-esteem. It makes the Americans think that that they can do this without the British help. Now, the colonial militia, and they're just farmers, right? They're just farmers who brought their guns out of their house and were guided by the British to fight the French or the Indians. And so these just random farmers who are not soldiers, they're hanging out together, and when the fighting goes bad, they actually witness these perceived invincible British soldiers cowering and crying and fleeing the enemy. And so this really shatters the myth of the British soldier being so good, because at the end of the day, they're no better than the American militiamen. The British officers were extremely arrogant. They treated the American militiamen like crap. They treated the American military leaders like crap because they didn't view them as Englishmen. Right? They viewed them as essentially poor white trash. And they refused to recognize any American militia commission above the rank of captain. And so this meant that guys like George Washington, who had a much higher ranking than that, got a demotion. Well, if you get a demotion, especially in the military, that is a huge slap in your face. It's really tough for your pride to take that, especially if you're from this kind of old-fashioned landed gentry where it's the Virginia aristocracy that Washington is from. The British were also pissed that the colonists didn't support the war as strongly as the British did. After all, the colonists, i.e. George Washington, started the damn war, and most of the war was fought in the colonies. And so the British felt that they were shouldering most of the burden for this war, and the colonists just weren't appreciative enough and didn't work as hard as the British did, so the British didn't like that. Another thing that the British didn't like, and this is probably with good reason, is American shippers, some merchants on the East Coast there, they actually traded illegally. They sent ships to and from the Spanish and French West Indies as part of the Triangle trade did not cease during the French and Indian War. In fact, if anything, there were more profits to be made during wartime trading with these entities. So, as far as the British were concerned, American merchants were trading with the enemy. Here's a map, and you've already seen this map, but it pays to see. North America prior to 1754. Well, no big surprise. Britain and the Americans win the French and Indian War. They win it. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 makes this map look very, very different. And you can see now, after the war, France has been completely kicked out of the New World, except for Santo Domingo, which later becomes Haiti. And so now all of the St. Lawrence River area, all of the Great Lakes, a big portion of the Midwest there is all owned by Britain. Britain is consolidated as two major New World territories. The only players now in 1763 are Britain and Spain. And Spain had been basically regressing for several generations. What's interesting to note, as you can see on the far left there, is Russia. Russia has started to get into the New World games. There's very, very few Russians actually living there. They kind of go along the same path as the French, and what I mean is that they're trading with the Indians. But there's the entire expanse of Siberia between Alaska and Moscow. So Russian colonization of the New World is absolutely minuscule. Alright, so the aftermath. 1763 is an absolutely huge year in this course, and you're going to be tested on three separate things that happened in 1763. The first one is that this is when the war ends, the Treaty of Paris, 1763. The second thing is Pontiac's Uprising, or Pontiac's War. What is it? Pontiac was an Ottawa chief. He was one of the chiefs of the Indian tribes in the Ohio Territory, and they fought alongside the French. And so after the Treaty of Paris, the Indians in this area realized that they are the true losers of the French and Indian War, because the French, there wasn't a whole lot of them to begin with. The French soldiers, they just go home. Who's left? Well, the Indians who lived there. And so all of their land, which, was kind of French territory, but it was really Indian territory, is now given over to the British. And the British, they've been hostile to the Indians ever since Jamestown. So Chief Pontiac gets together several Indian tribes from this area, and they attack. They attack the colonial settlements. They attack the British soldiers. They kill 2,000 colonists. Usually, the most of the people that they kill aren't British soldiers, but actually people just living in the woods in this area. They lay siege to Detroit. The British, of course, just like every other Indian war, whether it be British or later the United States, always responds the same way, right? Respond in bigger, crueler ways to the Indians, and then destroy the Indians. And so, what do the British do? But they, back then they had these places of quarantine, and so if you got smallpox, they just stuck you in these hospitals, and you either died of smallpox or you eventually got better and you survived. And so the British took some blankets from these smallpox quarantines and gave them to the Indians. So of course smallpox rages amongst the Indians, kills most of them, incapacitates the rest of them, and the British win Pontiac's War. It's one of the first uses of biological warfare in world history. But the British decide that they want to actually stabilize relations with the Indians. so they want to fix it. They don't want to be friends with the Indians, but they don't want to give the Indians another reason to attack once again. The British were pretty war weary, especially in the New World, and they had a big debt. They wanted some time of peace. So the British government passes the Proclamation of 1763. And what it is it drew a line in the map in the Appalachian Mountains, and it prohibited any settlement west of the Appalachians. And essentially, west of the Appalachians was Indian territory, east of the Appalachians was white territory. The colonists were pissed at this. You couldn't be a squatter, you couldn't obtain cheap land, and if you were one of the large families, such as the Washingtons, which allegedly owned thousands and thousands of acres in Ohio country, you now lost that land. So it was, in one fell swoop, Britain may have prevented some fighting with the Indians, but they pissed off a ton of colonists. And here in this map, you can see that red line is the Proclamation of 1763. Those purple arrows there, that's where the Pontiac Uprising was. What the interesting thing about this map is you can see how, we talked about during the last chapter, the fertility rate amongst Americans and how big their families were and how many pregnancies the women were and how the population was doubling every 25 years. Well, look at the shaded dark blue area there. That's European settlement prior to 1700. Then 63 years later, that green shaded territory is the settlement. So you can see just how large, how expansive. I mean, Georgia is basically created during this time period. There is no settlement prior to 1700. Charleston is the only area of South Carolina that has anybody living in there. Almost nobody in North Carolina except for the uppermost northern corner there. So you can see it was a huge amount of colonization, expansion. And so these Americans that are constantly expanding, you can see they've already met in several places this proclamation line of 1763. And so they get very pissed that they're not allowed to expand any further. Then just the chronology you can see here. It's got the King William's War, Queen Anne's War. You can see 1754 is when the French and Indian War starts. It commences and it ends in 1763. William Pitt, I guess you could talk a little bit about him. You don't see him too often. I wouldn't worry about him too much. He becomes the leader of the British government in 1757, and he's generally given credit as a very competent British official, and they win the war because he's good at logistics and treats people the right way and all this other stuff. The Battle of Quebec, which was the biggest battle, that was the main city of the French, that the British captured in 1759, and then the all-important year of 1763, where you get the Treaty of Paris, Pontiac's Uprising, and the Proclamation of 1763.